Chapter 32. Bar Mitzvah, at last. The next morning found Miriam, with Ari beside her, expertly threading her small Fiat through the maze of streets in the old city and out to the hilltop Holocaust Museum, not far from the Knesset. As they drove, he learned that she was a widow, having lost her husband of 6 weeks in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. They'd had no children, and she had never remarried. Sitting next to her, he felt a sense of easy and pleasant camaraderie between them, as though he'd known and respected this admirable woman all his life. And he sensed that she felt the same way about him. "It's going to be horrifying," Miriam warned Ari as they left the car in the parking lot and walked toward the sprawling complex. "So just be prepared. It's beyond anything you could imagine. I never cried so much. I mean, really wept, as the first time I went through." "Really?" he asked, not knowing how else to respond. "Of course, I lost a lot of relatives, and then, well, you're a man, and that makes a difference." "It's not sensationalized, I hope." "Not at all. I think you'll agree, when you see it, that the terror and repugnance of the Nazi Holocaust are presented solemnly and without vengeful rhetoric or the least bit of sensationalism." Ari was skeptical. Of course Miriam couldn't be objective. She was born and raised here in Israel. Entering the grounds, he could see in the faces of many who were already leaving the museum that they had been traumatized by the enormity of the evil documented within those halls. It had to be sensationalized. He would tell her gently, point it out as they went along. "We'll go to the Children's Monument first," said Miriam, taking Ari by the arm and leading him in that direction. It seemed such a natural thing to share in this way, as only a son and daughter of Judah could, the horror they were about to witness. "It was erected in memory of the 1.5 million children who died in the Holocaust," said Miriam in a voice tender with emotion as they approached the entrance. Ari's attention was first arrested by some photos and names of only a very few of the young victims. Then, in bold print, were emblazoned the words from the Proverbs of Israel's King Solomon: "God's candle is the spirit of man, searching the inward parts of the belly." "What does that mean?" Ari asked Miriam as they paused before entering. "I can't explain it. You'll see," was all she would say. "And God, why mention him here?" persisted Ari. "If he exists, and these were his chosen people, how could this have happened to them? Surely the Holocaust ought to be all the proof anyone needs that no God who cares about mankind exists, and Yad Vashem should be considered a memorial to that fact." "There is much I don't understand, but I know that God loves me," came the quiet response. "And he loves you too." She gave his arm a tug and pulled him gently forward. Stepping inside the darkened building, he stayed close beside Miriam as she led the way through a labyrinth of pitch blackness that was illuminated only by the flame of a single candle. That tiny pinpoint of light, reflected in unseen mirrors, seemed to occupy 1,000 places at once, floating eerily close at hand and fading off into the unmeasurable distance. Ari became aware of a voice echoing softly around him, moaning out in measured cadence the names and ages of the young Holocaust victims. Each had been someone's beloved child, whose once happy young life, filled with hope and promise, had been stamped into oblivion by heartless monsters who represented the most scientifically advanced and cultured nation on earth at that time. As the voice moaned relentlessly on, Ari felt the impact of each name like a sledgehammer blow to his soul. Innocent, tender, trusting, betrayed. Each had been a unique child, 1.5 million of them. What terror those young minds had endured, what torment and agony, what joys they had missed, and what inventions and cures for disease, what art and unimaginable potential of every kind the world itself had lost in the snuffing out of those young lives. Staggering out into the blazing sunlight again, Ari's voice broke. "I could have been a name spoken here," he whispered. Miriam put an arm about him. "By God's grace, you were spared." The words came softly, confidently, matter-of-factly. Why wasn't he angry? He should be. After all, was it God's grace that let millions of others be tortured and die? Miriam's words anticipated his unspoken complaint. "None of us deserves to live. God must have had something special for you to do." "Elor claims that the 9 rescued me, that they have something special planned for me. How do I know what's true? Is life itself a dream? A nightmare? Do we ever awaken?" Taking Ari's hand, Miriam pulled him along again. "This grove of trees that you see winding its way through the entire grounds," she said, waving her free arm, "is of special importance. Each one was planted in memory of one of the righteous, someone who saved Jewish lives. Some of the stories are beyond belief, yet they are true. They would make you weep." She stopped next to one of the trees. "We can't look at them all, but this one is very special." Ari looked down at a name identifying the one in whose memory the tree had been planted. It was Raoul Wallenberg. "I'm sure you know the story better than I. Refresh my memory," he asked reverently. "I teach this amazing story in school," replied Miriam. "All Israeli children know Wallenberg. He was a young man from a prominent Swedish family, brilliant, talented, handsome, with a full life ahead of him. He used his position as a diplomat in Budapest to issue false documents and to rescue nearly 50,000 Jews from the extermination camps. When the Russians liberated Hungary in January 1945, Wallenberg was arrested, and 2 days later he was reported dead. In fact, he had been taken to a Soviet labor camp where he spent some 20 years. 2 months after his death, the Soviets admitted that they had held him all that time. It's so tragic." "His crime?" asked Ari rhetorically, knowing the answer. "You can imagine," replied Miriam. "The communists couldn't afford any heroes on the wrong side." "It's ironic. Stalin's labor camps killed far more than Hitler's ovens," declared Ari numbly. "In both cases, the world stood by and did nothing. Communism grew, became the darling of Western liberals, was praised by university professors and students around the world, even though it went on to slaughter at least another 50 million after taking over China and Southeast Asia. It's repugnant and beyond belief." Ari turned to Miriam with an inner rage that could not be suppressed. Rage against the perpetrators of such unmitigated infamy and against those who never raised a voice or a hand to stop it. Really, where is justice in the world? Is there any hope? It was a question he had asked himself repeatedly, and in vain. "Not in this world," Miriam replied simply. He knew what she meant without further explanation. Was she a believer not only in God but in Jesus, like Nicole? She reminded him of Nicole. She exuded that same peaceful assurance that he had sensed in Nikki after her conversion. The two paused next in front of a weathered bronze monument, alive with small faces that reflected pathos, terror, anguish. "It's dedicated to the memory of Janusz Korczak, the principal of a Jewish orphanage in Poland," explained Miriam. "He was given the chance to save his own life, but he chose to stay with his children. For that, he was sent to Auschwitz, where he died. Here he is, immortalized in bronze, embracing his beloved orphans." Together they wandered on to pause, transfixed before the silent cry, the blackened bronze figure of a man weeping for a grief so great that it could not be voiced. Startled, Ari felt a warm trickle spill over and course down his cheeks. Miriam was weeping softly as well. Tenderly, Ari put an arm around her. How long they stood there in shared grief, he did not know. The immensity of evil that this place represented was far more than the mind and emotions could endure. Most repugnant was the fact that the Holocaust had been carried out methodically as official government policy and with the full power of state bureaucracy, ideology, and technology. Ari felt overwhelmed by despair for the future of mankind. The perfectibility of man was a sham, a mockery. If there was any hope, he found it in the fact that for every Nazi murderer there was someone who had risked his or her life to rescue the innocent victims of the most heinous crime in history. Inside the huge memorial that housed the eternal flame, Ari stood with head bowed, reading on the floor in front of him, in large letters, the names of the infamous Nazi extermination camps and killing fields: Belche, Lvov, Janowska, Drancy, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka, Buchenwald, Babi Yar. At the latter place, in one huge ditch, 150,000 Kiev Jews had been shot and buried where they fell. In the main museum, which Miriam had visited many times, she waited patiently at his side while Ari carefully read every document and description. He found the sights and sounds and the painstakingly detailed horror almost beyond belief. The exhibits documented the progressive steps the Nazis had taken in their attempt to effect a final solution to the Jewish problem. First came the economic boycotts against the Jewish populace. Then followed the Aryanization of Germany, which stripped Jews of property, jobs, and social status. How efficiently and meticulously the Germans had dehumanized the hated race. Technology, psychology, brilliantly and diabolically conceived pogroms, all had combined to perfect the juggernaut of extermination. Ari had encountered people in Europe who insisted that the Holocaust had never occurred, and there had been a time when he had half believed that evil theory because he had wanted to believe it. Here in Jerusalem, however, there was no denying the truth. One of the most stirring exhibits contained 129 pictures taken by one Heinz Jost, a German soldier, on September 19, 1941. In stark black and white detail, the photos documented the horrible reality of starvation and death in a Jewish ghetto. Corpses were lying in the streets where they had dropped and would remain until they were piled on carts and hauled away for mass burials. The helpless, hopeless expressions on the children's faces told the story more poignantly than words. The pathos of that silently endured terror and death, when the world closed its eyes, seemed to wring from Ari the last remaining emotion of which he was capable. These were Jews, his people. To his surprise, he found himself making that identification at last. A fierce pride stirred within as Ari read the description of the terrible slaughter of Jewish men, women, and children at Dubno in October 1942. The account was written by Hermann Friedrich Grebe, who had witnessed the occurrence from beginning to end. Grebe reported that as they were faced with death, not one cried out in fear, not one pleaded for mercy. Silently they embraced and kissed each other, said goodbye, then stood mutely, awaiting their fate. Reading Grebe's account made Ari proud to be Jewish. Surely his parents had endured their fate with the same unbending spirit. These were his people. The same blood flowed in his veins. And with that long overdue admission of his true racial identity came a renewed indignation that the world had not only stood by and done nothing, but that Britain, the United States, even neutral Switzerland, had refused to give refuge to the many Jews who had escaped and had even turned them back to Nazi ovens. Help for the Jews came only as a byproduct of the Allies' protection of their own interests and in retaliation against Hitler for his aggression. Nazi doctors performed inhuman experiments of which the West was well aware. The unashamedly obscene speeches of Nazi leaders telling what they were doing were no secret. Ari stood transfixed as he read the blatant, murderous intent expressed by Heinrich Himmler in a party speech at Posen, October 4, 1943. That talk included, "The Jewish race is in the process of being exterminated. Well, that's all right. That is our program, extermination of the Jews, and we are doing it. We are exterminating them. This thing is a splendid page in our history, which we will never write, and which shall never be written." Yad Vashem had written that terrifying history boldly and irrefutably documented for the world to see at last. Would the message be heeded? Having labored for years to effect an idealistic renewal of civilization, Ari now felt a helpless pessimism for its future. Near the end of the exhibits, Miriam pointed out an account of the dark role of Haj Amin el-Husseini, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. "I especially wanted you to see this," she whispered. "He was Yasser Arafat's uncle, hero, and mentor, and the PLO still embodies his destructive passion. Your grandfather mentioned him, Ari responded quietly, and turned his attention to the exhibit under the glass. There he read Haj Amin's May 15, 1943 letter to German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, requesting German intervention in the Balkans, especially in Bulgaria, in order to prevent the Jews from leaving for Eretz Israel. The Mufti assured Ribbentrop that the Arabs supported the Axis powers in their final solution to the problem of the Jews, the common enemy of the peoples of Europe and the Arab nations. In the same display was a copy of a cable from Himmler to the Grand Mufti on the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, November 2, 1943. The National Socialist Party has inscribed on its flag the extermination of world Jewry. Our party sympathizes with the fight of the Arabs, especially the Arabs of Palestine, against the foreign Jew. Today, on this Memorial Day of the Balfour Declaration, I send my greetings and wishes for success in your fight. Signed, Leader of the SS. Haj Amin, an admirer of Hitler, especially for his Jewish policy, had managed to flee to Germany. On March 1, 1944, over Radio Berlin, the Mufti issued his inflammatory call. Arabs, rise as one man and fight for your sacred rights. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God and religion. This saves your honor. God is with you. There it was, the horrifying reality, all documented under glass. After reading these appalling words, Ari pulled Miriam close to him and whispered, I'm almost persuaded that your grandfather's right. Such unbelievable hatred has no ordinary explanation. Miriam nodded. We're God's chosen people, and we rebelled against him, and he isn't going to let us go. All I know, replied Ari, is that nothing has changed. The same murderous obscenities calling for the destruction of Israel still blast forth from loudspeakers in mosques and on radios in the streets in Arab houses, and the world is just as deaf and blind to those threats as it was to Hitler's. Silently, Miriam clung to Ari. Barely audibly, she heard him breathe the words, never again, never again. Softly, she repeated the same heartbreaking refrain. As the two stood transfixed by what they had just read, an elderly Orthodox Jew with a long beard and flowing black coat came up and stood beside them. He began quietly reading aloud in a solemn voice Haj Amin's radio message. Then Ari noticed that a young boy and girl of about 10 and 12, apparently his grandchildren, were standing just behind him and listening in wide-eyed horror. When the old gentleman had finished reading, he half turned to Ari and Miriam as though to include them as he told the children, that man's nephew, Yasser Arafat, heads the PLO. Its charter today still calls for the destruction of Israel. Nothing has changed since Hitler announced his intentions to the world. And no one pays any more attention now than they did then. One day, Israel will have to fight the whole world. Is that paranoia or realism? Ari pondered the question as he and Miriam stood silently watching the old gentleman and his two grandchildren move slowly on. I don't know whether he came to that conclusion from his own convictions or from the Bible, whispered Miriam. But he's right. Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament warn that in the last days all the nations of the world will attack Israel, hoping to destroy her, and the Messiah will intervene and save his people. And you believe this? She nodded. Of course. It's true, Ari. It's true. On any other occasion, Ari would have made a derisive comment, but not here. Not at Yad Vashem. The horror was so overwhelming, and the forces still arrayed against the Jewish people so powerful, and their relationship to what happened under Hitler so undeniable, that only a Messiah could save them from total annihilation. And I thought it was paranoia, mused Ari as they left the museum and walked silently and slowly, hand in hand, back to Miriam's car. If it's paranoia, then I'm becoming crazy too. Never again. Words seemed almost sacrilegious on the short drive back to the old city. What could one say after such an experience? Sensationalism? Miriam asked at last. Please forgive me, was the quiet response. Vehicular traffic could only come within 2 blocks of Yaakov's apartment, and there was no place to park in the busy, narrow street. Miriam stopped to let Ari out. "Why not park somewhere so you can come in for a few moments?" he suggested hopefully. She shook her head. "I've hardly been with my cousin. I must spend some time with her." She was avoiding his eyes now. Reluctantly, Ari climbed out and closed the door. Leaning in through the window, he asked anxiously, "When will I see you again?" She turned toward him and smiled. "When would you like to?" Their eyes met. "As soon as possible," he said as he returned her smile. "Well, Grandpa has my address." "I've never been to Tiberias," he stammered, "and I have no car." She laughed. "There's a bus. Something you really want is worth the effort, isn't it?" A chorus of horns was sounding. Miriam reached out and touched Ari's arm. "I've got a car. How about next weekend?" "Friday night?" "Friday night. It'll be 8 before I can get here. I'll come to Grandpa's apartment and we'll go out for dinner, okay?" "You shouldn't have to drive all the way up here." A taxi driver had jumped out and was running toward them, cursing loudly and flailing his arms as he ran. "I've got relatives in Jerusalem that I ought to visit," replied Miriam, raising her voice above the bedlam. "And you heard my grandfather scold me for not coming often enough." "I'm with him on that," yelled Ari as she drove away. He stood there looking longingly after her car until it disappeared, aware that her departure had left an aching emptiness in his soul. Yaakov took one look at Ari when he arrived at the apartment a few minutes later and knew that a profound change had come over him. "Now you know," he said simply, "like the rest of us." "Yes, yes, now I know," responded Ari somberly. "It's maddening that the world could let this happen. Doesn't speak too well of evolving man," he added with a bitter irony. "No, the world has not gotten better," remarked Yaakov sadly. "Israel can't count on any friends to rescue her, not even the United States. She has to be strong, ready to defend herself." "I think I'm paranoid too," added Ari. "Never again." "Spoken like a true Israeli," exclaimed Yaakov, lighting up with that contagious smile and patting Ari affectionately on the shoulder. "Today I feel like I've had my bar mitzvah at last," declared Ari enthusiastically. "I'm proud to be a Jew," he added almost fiercely. Yaakov reached out to shake Ari's hand, but felt himself enclosed in a bear hug instead.